What happens when one of music's biggest icons comes face to face with a political commentator who won't back down? When respect collides with interrogation, and a conversation meant to celebrate a legacy turns into something nobody saw coming. Today we're breaking down the moment Janet Jackson walked off the Views set, leaving the entire panel speechless and the audience in complete shock. Before we get into this, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on in this whole situation. Because trust me, you're going to have an opinion by the end of this video. So Janet Jackson was invited to The View to discuss her upcoming tour and reflect on her incredible career spanning over 4 decades. The segment was supposed to be a celebration, a chance for fans to hear from Janet about her music, her creative process, and what she's been working on. But what started as a friendly interview quickly spiraled into one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history. The conversation began smoothly enough. Whoopi Goldberg opened with warm remarks about Janet's influence on pop culture, and the other co-hosts chimed in with questions about her tour rehearsals and what fans could expect from the shows. Janet was relaxed, smiling, sharing anecdotes about working with her dancers and the excitement of getting back on stage. She talked about how performing live gives her energy, how connecting with her audience is what she lives for. Everything seemed perfectly pleasant. Then Alyssa Farah Griffin, who joined The View as a co-host after her career in Republican politics, shifted the tone. Her first question seemed innocent enough. She asked Janet about using her platform to speak on social issues, referencing how artists today are expected to take public stances on everything from voting rights to international conflicts. Janet nodded politely, acknowledging that artists do have influence. But she also emphasized that her focus has always been on her art first. Alyssa pressed further. She brought up a recent interview where Janet had made comments that some people interpreted as politically ambiguous. She asked Janet directly whether she felt a responsibility to clarify her positions, especially given her massive global following. The energy in the room shifted immediately. You could see Janet's expression change, her smile fading just slightly. She took a breath and responded calmly, saying that she's spent her entire career letting her music speak for itself, and that she's never believed in performing her politics for public consumption. Alyssa didn't let it go. She leaned in, her tone becoming sharper, more prosecutorial. She said that in today's climate, silence can be interpreted as complicity, and that public figures have a duty to use their voices for good. Janet's jaw tightened. She replied that she's been using her voice for decades, through her music, through her advocacy work that doesn't always make headlines, and that she doesn't need to prove her values to anyone, especially not in a televised ambush. The word ambush hung in the air. Sunny Hostin tried to interject, attempting to lighten the mood, but Alyssa kept going. She brought up a controversy from years ago, something that had already been discussed and dissected endlessly in the media. She asked Janet if she regretted how she handled it, if she would do things differently now. Janet's posture straightened. Her voice remained controlled, but there was steel in it now. She said that she's made peace with her past, that she's grown from every experience, and that constantly relitigating old wounds wasn't productive for anyone. Alyssa countered by saying that accountability requires reflection, and that public figures especially need to model that kind of introspection. Janet looked directly at her and said, with perfect composure, that she's done plenty of reflecting, but that this interview was supposed to be about her tour and her music, not a trial for things that happened years ago. She asked if they could get back to the reason she agreed to come on the show. There was an awkward silence. Whoopi tried to redirect, asking Janet about the setlist for her tour. Janet started to answer, her voice warm again as she described some of the classic hits she'd be performing and a few surprises she had planned. But then Alyssa jumped back in. She asked whether Janet felt her older music, some of which contained themes and language that might not align with today's sensibilities, should come with disclaimers or context for younger audiences. Janet stopped mid-sentence. She turned slowly to look at Alyssa, her expression a mix of disbelief and restrained anger. She asked Alyssa to clarify what she meant. Alyssa explained that some artists have addressed how their past work might be viewed through a contemporary lens, and whether Janet had considered doing the same. Janet's response was measured but firm. She said her music has always been about empowerment, about breaking boundaries, and that suggesting it needs disclaimers was not only insulting to her artistry, but also to the millions of fans who found strength and identity in those songs. Alyssa said she wasn't trying to insult anyone, just asking questions that viewers might be thinking. Janet replied that maybe Alyssa should trust viewers to think for themselves, instead of framing loaded questions disguised as curiosity. The tension was palpable now. Sarah N. attempted to jump in with a question about Janet's fashion choices for the tour, clearly trying to steer things away from conflict, but the damage was done. Alyssa, seemingly unable to let it go, circled back to the idea of legacy and how artists protect it. She asked Janet if she ever worried about being on the wrong side of history. Janet let out a short, incredulous laugh. She said she's been making history for 40 years, that her legacy is secure, and that she doesn't need validation from anyone, especially not from someone who seems more interested in creating controversy than having a genuine conversation. Alyssa's face flushed. She said she was just doing her job as a journalist, asking tough questions. Janet shot back that there's a difference between tough questions and disrespectful interrogation, and that this interview had crossed that line multiple times. Whoopi tried to calm things down, saying they were all just having a spirited discussion, but Janet wasn't having it. She said spirited discussions require mutual respect, and that she hadn't felt respected since the conversation turned away from her work and into a cross-examination of her character. Joy Behar, who had been mostly quiet, tried to make a joke to break the tension, but it fell flat. The audience was silent, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Alyssa, perhaps realizing she'd pushed too far, but unable to back down, said that if Janet couldn't handle difficult questions, maybe she wasn't ready for the scrutiny that comes with being in the public eye. That was the moment everything changed. Janet's expression went completely neutral. She set down the glass of water she'd been holding and calmly removed her microphone. She looked directly at Alyssa and said, in a voice that was quiet but absolutely cutting, that she's handled more scrutiny in her career than Alyssa could possibly imagine, that she's faced down critics, media storms, and personal tragedies, all while maintaining her dignity and her art. She said she doesn't need to sit here and be lectured by someone who mistakes rudeness for bravery. The other co-hosts were frozen, unsure how to respond. Janet stood up, thanked Whoopi and the other hosts for having her, specifically excluding Alyssa from her gratitude, and said she hoped they'd understand why she couldn't continue. Whoopi stood up too, reaching out to Janet, asking her to stay, saying they could move on to other topics. Janet shook her head gently, giving Whoopi a small, sad smile. She said some things can't be moved past, and that she values herself too much to sit in a space where she's not valued. Alyssa finally spoke up, saying that Janet was overreacting, that this is what happens on talk shows. People debate and disagree. Janet turned back to her one last time and said that debate requires good faith, and that what Alyssa had done wasn't debate. It was an attempt to diminish her under the guise of intellectual discourse. She said she spent too many years fighting for respect to give it away now. With that, Janet started walking toward the exit. The cameras followed her every step, and you could hear the collective gasp from the studio audience. This wasn't a commercial break walk-off. This wasn't a planned dramatic moment. This was real, and everyone in that room knew it. Alyssa sat back in her chair, her face a mixture of defensiveness and shock, while the other hosts looked at each other in complete disbelief at what had just unraveled in front of millions of viewers. Whoopi called out to Janet one more time, her voice carrying genuine concern and urgency. She said that they could take a break, that they could reset and start fresh. Janet paused near the edge of the set, turning slightly but not fully facing the panel. She said, with a voice that was tired but unwavering, that some things don't deserve a reset, that she came here in good faith to talk about her passion, her music, her connection with her fans, and instead she was put on trial for existing as a complex human being with decades of experiences. Sarah N. spoke up, her voice emotional, saying that they all respected Janet immensely, and that this wasn't how anyone wanted this to go. Janet's expression softened just a fraction when she looked at Sarah. She acknowledged that she believed Sarah and the others meant well, but that intentions don't erase impact. She said that when one person at a table is allowed to repeatedly attack a guest without consequence, it sends a message about what that table truly values. Sunny Hostin, who practices law and understands the power of words, chimed in with an attempt at mediation. She said that sometimes in passionate conversations, lines get crossed unintentionally, and that perhaps everyone could benefit from taking a step back and recognizing where things went wrong. Janet appreciated Sunny's attempt at fairness. You could see it in the slight nod she gave, but she also pointed out that there was nothing unintentional about the line of questioning she'd endured. She said every question was designed to put her on the defensive, to make her justify her existence, her choices, her art, and her silence on things she's never been silent about. Alyssa, who had been sitting quietly during these exchanges, finally spoke again. Her tone was different now, less aggressive but still defensive. She said that she never intended to attack Janet, that she was simply trying to have the kind of substantive conversation that The View is known for. She claimed that if Janet couldn't distinguish between challenging questions and personal attacks, then maybe the problem wasn't with the questions themselves. That statement landed like a bomb. Joy Behar immediately cut in, telling Alyssa that maybe now wasn't the time to double down. Joy, who has been on The View long enough to know when a situation has gone beyond repair, looked genuinely upset. She turned to Janet and said that she understood why Janet felt disrespected, and that she was sorry this interview had taken such a turn. Joy's apology seemed sincere, rooted in decades of understanding how these conversations can spiral when egos and agendas clash. Janet thanked Joy for her words, acknowledging that Joy has always been straightforward and honest in her approach. She then addressed the audience directly, something the hosts weren't expecting. She turned toward the crowd and said that she wanted them to know she appreciates every single person who has supported her throughout her career, who has found meaning in her music, who has stood by her through every high and low. She said that leaving this set doesn't mean she's running from difficult conversations. It means she's choosing not to participate in conversations that aren't really conversations at all. The audience erupted in applause. It was spontaneous, loud, and overwhelming. People stood up, clapping and cheering for Janet, and in that moment, the power dynamic in the room completely shifted. This wasn't just about a celebrity walking off a talk show anymore. This was about dignity, about knowing your worth, about refusing to be diminished. The hosts sat there, surrounded by applause for the woman who was leaving, and the weight of what had just happened was written all over their faces. Alyssa looked stunned by the audience's reaction. She tried to speak over the applause, saying something about how disagreement is healthy and necessary, but her words were drowned out. Whoopi stood up again and started clapping too, joining the audience in their support for Janet. That gesture spoke volumes. Whoopi, who has navigated Hollywood for decades and knows exactly how brutal the industry can be, was making it clear where she stood. Janet gave Whoopi a genuine smile, a moment of connection between two women who have both fought their own battles in the public eye. Then Janet waved to the audience, blew them a kiss, and walked off the set for good. The camera stayed on the empty chair where she had been sitting just minutes before, the visual metaphor impossible to ignore. The segment was supposed to run another 15 minutes. Instead, there was just silence and an empty seat. Whoopi tried to regain control of the show. She turned to the camera and said they were going to take a commercial break, that they'd be back in a moment, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. As they cut away, you could see the remaining hosts turning toward Alyssa, their expressions saying everything that couldn't be said on live television. The break wasn't long enough to diffuse what had just happened, and when they came back, the energy was completely different. When the show returned, Whoopi addressed the audience and viewers at home directly. She said that what everyone just witnessed was unexpected, that emotions ran high, and that sometimes interviews don't go the way anyone plans. She didn't throw Alyssa under the bus, but she also didn't defend what had happened. She simply acknowledged the reality of it. Joy jumped in, adding that Janet Jackson is a legend who deserves respect, and that she hoped viewers understood that the panel has tremendous admiration for Janet's body of work and her contributions to music and culture. Sunny took a more analytical approach, discussing how interviews with public figures often involve a tension between celebration and accountability, and that finding the right balance is an art form in itself. She said that perhaps today that balance was lost, and that everyone involved, including the hosts, could learn from what transpired. It was a diplomatic statement, one that acknowledged fault without placing blame squarely on anyone's shoulders. Sarah spoke from the heart, saying that she personally felt terrible about how things unfolded. She said that Janet is someone she's admired since childhood, and that seeing her leave the set in that way was heartbreaking. Sarah's voice cracked slightly as she spoke, and it was clear she was genuinely affected by what had happened. She said she hoped Janet knew that not everyone at the table shared the same approach, and that some of them truly just wanted to celebrate her. Then it was Alyssa's turn to speak. The other hosts looked at her expectantly, and so did the audience. Alyssa took a breath and said that she stood by her questions, that they were fair and appropriate for someone of Janet Jackson's stature and influence. She said that she believed in holding public figures accountable, regardless of their fame or legacy, and that she didn't think she had done anything wrong. The studio went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Joy couldn't help herself. She turned to Alyssa and said, on live television, that there's a difference between holding someone accountable and being needlessly combative. She said that journalists need to know when they're informing and when they're just performing. It was a direct criticism, and coming from Joy, who rarely holds back, it carried weight. Alyssa's face tightened, but she didn't respond. She just sat there, visibly uncomfortable, while the audience murmured in agreement with Joy's assessment. Whoopi, ever the professional, tried to move the show forward. She introduced the next segment, something lighthearted and completely unrelated to what had just happened, but nobody was really paying attention anymore. The damage was done, and everyone knew it. Social media was already exploding with reactions. Clips of Janet's exit were being shared thousands of times per minute, and the hashtags were trending worldwide within 20 minutes of the incident. The rest of the show felt like an afterthought. The hosts went through the motions, discussing the planned topics, but the energy was gone. Alyssa remained mostly quiet for the remainder of the episode, clearly shaken by both Janet's departure and the reaction from her fellow co-hosts and the audience. Whoopi wrapped up the show with her usual sign-off, but even that felt subdued, like everyone was just waiting for the cameras to turn off so they could process what had really happened. What made this situation even more explosive was the immediate public reaction. Social media wasn't just buzzing, it was on fire. Team Janet emerged instantly, with fans, fellow artists, and even people who weren't particularly familiar with her work all rallying behind her decision to walk off. They praised her for standing up for herself, for refusing to be disrespected, for showing that even icons have boundaries. The clips of her calm but firm responses to Alyssa, followed by her dignified exit, became instant viral moments. On the other side, there were people defending Alyssa, arguing that she was just doing her job as a journalist, that tough questions are necessary, and that celebrities shouldn't be above scrutiny just because they're famous. This group pointed out that public figures benefit enormously from their platforms and therefore should be willing to answer difficult questions about their influence and their choices. They argued that Janet's walk-off was an overreaction, a diva moment, an unwillingness to engage with legitimate criticism. But even among Alyssa's defenders, there was a growing acknowledgement that something about the interview felt off. It wasn't just that the questions were tough, it was how they were asked, the relentless nature of them, the refusal to accept Janet's answers and move on. Even people who generally support aggressive journalism started questioning whether this was actually journalism or just an attempt to create a viral moment at a guest's expense. Media analysts and fellow journalists weighed in throughout the day. Some praised Alyssa for not treating Janet with kid gloves, for refusing to conduct a puff-piece interview just because someone is famous. But other journalists pushed back hard, pointing out that when someone comes on a show specifically to promote a tour, ambushing them with aggressive political questioning isn't good journalism. It's a betrayal of the premise under which the guest agreed to appear. Several high-profile musicians and entertainers spoke out in support of Janet. Some shared their own experiences of being blindsided during interviews, of agreeing to appear on shows to discuss their art only to find themselves defending their entire existence instead. They talked about how exhausting it is to constantly be put in positions where you have to prove you're worthy of respect, where your decades of work mean nothing if you don't perform your politics in exactly the way someone demands. One veteran music journalist who has interviewed Janet multiple times wrote a detailed thread explaining how what Alyssa did violated the unwritten contracts that exist between interviewers and subjects. The journalist pointed out that Janet has never shied away from difficult topics in appropriate contexts, but that the View interview was supposed to be about celebration and promotion, not an inquisition. The thread was shared tens of thousands of times. The View's social media accounts were flooded with comments. Even the network's own comment sections leaned heavily toward supporting Janet. People shared their own stories of being disrespected in professional settings, of having to make the difficult choice between enduring mistreatment or standing up for themselves. Janet's walk-off became bigger than just a celebrity moment. It became symbolic of a larger conversation about respect, boundaries, and power dynamics. Some of the most thoughtful commentary focused on the generational clash. Janet comes from an era where artists maintained mystique, where art spoke louder than statements. Alyssa represents a newer media landscape, where silence is interpreted as complicity and public figures must constantly perform their values. The clash between these two worldviews played out in real time on national television, and neither side was willing to back down. Longtime viewers noted that The View has always featured heated debates, but those debates are usually between the co-hosts themselves, not directed at guests in such an aggressive manner. There's an important distinction between the co-hosts challenging each other, which the audience tunes in to see, and targeting a guest, which feels less like debate and more like an ambush. What made Janet's response particularly powerful was its restraint. She didn't yell, didn't insult anyone, didn't make a scene in the traditional sense. She simply stated her boundaries, explained why they'd been crossed, and removed herself from the situation. That kind of calm assertion of dignity is rare, especially on live television where emotions run high. Many people pointed out that Janet's exit was a masterclass in maintaining composure while standing up for yourself. The incident highlighted the impossible position many public figures find themselves in. If Janet had stayed, she would have been giving legitimacy to questioning she found disrespectful, essentially rewarding bad behavior. But by leaving, she opened herself up to criticism that she can't handle scrutiny, that she's difficult, that she's a diva. There was no winning move, and Janet chose the option that preserved her self-respect even if it came with professional risks. What became clear was that this wasn't just about one interview gone wrong. It was about fundamental questions society is grappling with right now. How do we balance accountability with respect? How do we have difficult conversations without descending into attacks? How do we know when we're being brave journalists versus when we're just being mean? The Janet Jackson incident became a focal point for exploring these questions that don't have easy answers. The power of the moment lay in its authenticity. This wasn't scripted drama or manufactured controversy. It was a real person making a real decision in real time, choosing dignity over compliance, self-respect over people-pleasing. In an age where so much is carefully curated and controlled, witnessing someone make such a raw, honest choice struck a chord with millions who have faced similar crossroads in their own lives. Whether you think Janet was right to leave or should have stayed. Whether you think Alyssa was doing important journalism or being unnecessarily aggressive. The incident forced everyone to think about these issues. It created conversations everywhere about respect, boundaries, and what we owe each other in public discourse. And perhaps that's the most valuable outcome. Not the viral clips or trending hashtags, but the deeper reflection it prompted about how we treat each other when cameras are rolling. Janet Jackson walked off The View, but she walked away with something far more important, intact: her dignity, her sense of self, and the respect of millions who watched her refuse to be diminished. She made a statement that will be remembered far longer than any carefully managed interview ever could. She showed that knowing your worth means being willing to walk away from situations that don't honor it, regardless of the cost. So there you have it, the complete breakdown of what happened when Janet Jackson stormed off The View. After that heated clash with Alyssa Farah Griffin, if you made it this far, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're covering all the biggest entertainment stories as they happen. And drop a comment below answering this question. If you were in Janet's position, would you have walked off or stayed and continued the interview? Let me know what you think because I'm reading every single comment.